The security footage from Ouagadougou Central Hospital would later be studied by psychologists around the world, not for what it revealed about crime or politics, but for what it showed about the heart of a leader. At 11:47 p.m. on a rainy Thursday night, Ibrahim Traoré was making an unannounced visit to check on the hospital's new pediatric wing when he heard something that made him freeze in the corridor, the weak, desperate cry of a newborn baby coming from a supply closet. What he found behind that door would not only change one infant's life forever, but would also reveal a hidden crisis that had been destroying families across Burkina Faso for years. But the decision Traoré made in that moment, witnessed only by a handful of shocked medical staff, would become the most controversial and transformative policy of his presidency. But to understand why that moment was so significant, we need to go back 3 hours earlier, to a conversation that had brought Traoré to the hospital in the first place. The call had come from Dr. Amara Keita, the hospital's chief pediatrician, and what she told him would expose a crisis that the government had been trying to hide for months. "Mr. President," Dr. Keita had said, her voice breaking with exhaustion and frustration, "I need to show you something that your ministers don't want you to see. But if you don't see it tonight, another baby will die tomorrow." The urgency in her voice had convinced Traoré to cancel his evening meetings and drive to the hospital immediately. What Dr. Keita revealed when he arrived would shatter his understanding of the healthcare crisis facing his country. She led him through corridors that reeked of disinfectant and desperation, past overcrowded wards where mothers sat on the floor holding sick children, to a small room that served as her office. On her desk were photographs that would haunt Traoré for the rest of his life. "Mr. President," she said, spreading the images across the desk. "In the past 6 months, we've found 17 abandoned babies in this hospital alone. 17 newborns left to die because their mothers couldn't afford the $50 delivery fee." The photographs showed tiny faces, some peaceful, in death, others crying out for help that would never come. Each image was accompanied by a case file documenting the circumstances of abandonment. Teenage mothers thrown out by their families, women whose husbands had fled when they couldn't pay hospital bills, mothers who chose between saving their babies or feeding their other children. "This is Aisha," Dr. Keita said, pointing to a photograph of a baby girl who couldn't have been more than days old. Her mother was 17, working as a maid for a wealthy family. When they discovered she was pregnant, they fired her. She gave birth alone in an alley, then brought the baby here hoping we could save her. When we demanded payment up front, she left the baby in the bathroom and disappeared. Traoré studied the photograph, feeling something break inside his chest. "What happened to Aisha?" "She died of pneumonia 3 days later," Dr. Keita replied quietly. "We could have saved her with antibiotics that cost less than $5, but hospital policy requires payment before treatment." The revelation hit Traoré like a physical blow. His own government's healthcare policies were forcing mothers to abandon their children to die. But Dr. Keita wasn't finished with her devastating presentation. "Mr. President, there's something else you need to understand. These aren't just isolated cases of poverty. There's a systematic problem that's getting worse every month." She pulled out a thick folder filled with medical records and financial documents. "Your Ministry of Health has been inflating medical costs to pad their budgets while cutting funding for emergency care. A normal delivery that should cost $20 is being charged at $50. Emergency pediatric care that used to be free now requires upfront payment of $100 or more." The corruption was staggering. Government officials were profiting from policies that literally forced mothers to choose between bankruptcy and watching their children die. "But here's the most heartbreaking part," Dr. Keita continued, her voice now shaking with anger. "Many of these mothers don't actually abandon their babies by choice. They hide nearby, hoping someone will find their children and provide the care they can't afford. Some mothers have been caught sleeping in hospital stairwells, watching over babies they officially abandoned, but refused to actually leave. The image of desperate mothers secretly watching over children they couldn't afford to save was almost too painful for Traoré to process. But Dr. Keita had one more revelation that would change everything. "Mr. President, I believe there's a baby in this hospital right now whose mother is somewhere in this building, too terrified to come forward, but too heartbroken to leave." That was when she led him on the walk through the hospital that would end with the discovery that would transform his presidency. As they moved through the corridors, Dr. Keita explained the signs she had learned to recognize. When mothers abandon babies out of desperation rather than indifference, they leave clues. They wrap the children in their own clothing. They write notes even when they can't read, and they stay close by. I've learned to look for women who seem to be visiting but have no patient to see, who linger in corridors near the pediatric ward, who ask questions about babies they claim to have no connection to. They had been walking through the pediatric wing when both of them heard it, the weak cry that had stopped Traoré in his tracks. The sound was coming from a supply closet that should have been empty and locked. Dr. Keita's face went pale as she fumbled for her keys. "No," she whispered, "please no, not again." When the door opened, they found a scene that would be seared into both their memories forever. A baby girl, perhaps 6 hours old, lay wrapped in a woman's headscarf on a pile of clean medical linens. Pinned to the fabric was a note written in shaky handwriting. "Her name is Hope. Please save her. I will pay you back someday, I promise." Traoré knelt beside the infant, his hands trembling as he picked her up. The baby was cold but breathing, her tiny fingers grasping instinctively at his shirt. In that moment, looking down at this child whose mother had named her Hope despite having none herself, something fundamental shifted inside the president of Burkina Faso. "Dr. Keita," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "find this baby's mother. Find her now. Mr. President, that might not be. Find her," Traoré repeated, his tone carrying presidential authority. "Check every floor, every waiting room, every stairwell. Look for a woman who appears to have recently given birth, who seems distressed, who keeps glancing toward the pediatric wing. She's here somewhere." While Dr. Keita organized the search, Traoré did something that his security detail would later describe as unprecedented. He sat down on the floor of the supply closet, cradling the baby girl, and refused to move until her mother was found. "Mr. President," his chief of security urged, "this is not safe. We should take you back to the palace and let the hospital handle this." "This is exactly where I need to be," Traoré replied firmly. "This baby was abandoned because my government's policies forced her mother to choose between her child's life and her family's survival. I'm not leaving until we fix this." 23 minutes later, Dr. Keita returned with a young woman who looked barely 18 years old. She was wearing only one shoe, her clothes were stained with blood, and her eyes were swollen from crying. When she saw Traoré holding her baby, she collapsed to her knees. "Please don't arrest me," she sobbed in Moray, the local language. "I couldn't let her die, but I couldn't pay. They said she needed medicine, but I don't have money. I sold everything I had just to get here." Traoré looked at this young mother, barely more than a child herself, and saw the face of a country that his government had failed. But what she told him next would reveal a corruption scandal that reached the highest levels of his administration. "The nurse told me the baby needed special care that would cost 200,000 francs, the young woman continued. "She said if I couldn't pay immediately, they would let my baby die. I begged them to treat her and let me work off the debt, but they said hospital policy required upfront payment." Dr. Keita's face darkened with anger. "Mr. President, the treatment this baby needs costs 15,000 francs, not 200,000. Someone was trying to extort this mother. The price inflation was criminal. Nurses and administrators were deliberately overcharging desperate mothers, pocketing the difference while forcing families into impossible situations." But as Traoré questioned the young mother further, an even more disturbing pattern emerged. Her name was Salamata. She was 17 years old, and this was the third baby she had tried to save at this hospital. "My first baby died because I couldn't pay for delivery," she explained through tears. "My second baby died because they demanded money for oxygen. I thought maybe this time if I left her where someone kind would find her, she might live." Salamata wasn't just a desperate mother. She was a victim of a healthcare system that had been systematically corrupted by officials who profited from human misery. Traoré made a decision that would shock everyone present. He stood up, still, holding baby Hope, and addressed the small crowd of medical staff who had gathered. Effective immediately, he announced. All emergency pediatric care in Burkina Faso is free. No child will die because their parents cannot pay. No mother will be forced to abandon her baby for lack of money. The doctors and nurses exchanged glances of disbelief. Such a policy change would require parliamentary approval, budget allocations, and months of bureaucratic process. But Traoré wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am personally adopting this baby and her mother. Salamata will live in the presidential palace as my daughter, and Hope will grow up as my granddaughter. If the healthcare system fails the most vulnerable citizens, then the president's family will include those citizens. The announcement sent shockwaves through the hospital. No African president had ever made such a personal commitment to healthcare reform. Dr. Keita stepped forward, her voice filled with emotion. Mr. President, while we support your intentions, the practical implications— Dr. Keita, Traoré interrupted. I want you to calculate the cost of providing free emergency pediatric care for the entire country. Then I want you to calculate how much money is being stolen through inflated medical bills and administrative corruption. I guarantee you'll find that honest healthcare costs less than corrupt healthcare. What happened over the next 72 hours would transform not just Burkina Faso's healthcare system, but also the relationship between the government and its most vulnerable citizens. Traoré kept his word. Salamata and baby Hope moved into a wing of the presidential palace that had been converted into a family residence. But more importantly, teams of investigators began auditing every hospital in the country, uncovering a web of corruption that reached shocking depths. The investigation revealed that healthcare corruption was stealing approximately $50 million annually from the national budget, money that could have provided free emergency care for every child in Burkina Faso twice over. Hospital administrators had been systematically inflating costs, splitting profits with government officials, and creating artificial scarcities to drive up prices. The $50 delivery fee that was forcing mothers to abandon babies actually covered services that cost less than $8 to provide. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators traced the corruption network back to its source. The scheme was being coordinated by Deputy Health Minister Marcus Diabre, who had been skimming healthcare funds to finance a luxury lifestyle while children died from treatable illnesses. When Diabre was arrested, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Bank records showed he had stolen over $2 million from healthcare budgets while publicly advocating for fiscal responsibility in medical spending. The corruption scandal dominated international headlines, but it was Traoré's personal response that captured global attention. Rather than simply firing corrupt officials and announcing policy changes, he had made the crisis personal by bringing its victims into his own family. Salamata's presence in the presidential palace became a powerful symbol of government accountability. During official meetings with foreign dignitaries, she would often be present with baby Hope, serving as a living reminder of the human cost of failed policies. But the real transformation came in the weeks following the adoption. Traoré established the Hope Foundation, named after the baby who had changed everything, with a mission to ensure that no child in Burkina Faso would ever die from treatable illness due to inability to pay. The foundation's first initiative was revolutionary. Every hospital in the country would have a Hope ward providing free emergency care for children, funded directly by the presidential budget and monitored by independent auditors to prevent corruption. 3 months after finding baby Hope in that supply closet, the results were already dramatic. Child mortality rates had dropped by 30%. Hospital abandonment cases had virtually disappeared, and Burkina Faso's healthcare system was being studied by other African nations as a model for reform. But perhaps the most powerful symbol of change came during Traoré's first public appearance after the adoption. He arrived at a healthcare conference carrying Hope in his arms, with Salamata by his side wearing traditional dress and a university student badge. Traoré had also enrolled her in medical school so she could become a pediatric nurse. 6 months ago, Traoré told the assembled healthcare professionals, this young woman was forced to abandon her baby because our system valued money more than life. Today, she's studying to become a healer, and her daughter will grow up in a country where every child's life has value regardless of their parents' wealth. The audience gave them a standing ovation, but it was Salamata's words that brought many to tears. "Mr. President saved my baby's life," she said in halting French, "but more importantly, he saved my hope. Now I want to save other mothers' hope too." The transformation was remarkable. In less than a year, Salamata had learned to read and write, was excelling in her medical studies, and had become a powerful advocate for healthcare reform. Hope, meanwhile, was thriving under the care of the presidential household staff, who had embraced their unusual role as caretakers for the first granddaughter. The international reaction to Traoré's adoption was mixed but intense. Western media praised his compassion, while questioning the precedent of presidents personally adopting citizens. African media celebrated the move as evidence of authentic leadership that prioritized people over politics, but the most meaningful response came from ordinary Burkina Faso citizens. Hospitals across the country reported that the number of abandoned babies had dropped to zero, while community donations to the Hope Foundation had exceeded all expectations. 1 year after that rainy Thursday night at Ouagadougou Central Hospital, Traoré returned to the supply closet where he had found Hope. The room had been converted into a memorial space with photographs of all the children who had been saved by the free emergency care program. Dr. Keita, now promoted to National Director of Pediatric Health, accompanied him on the visit. "Mr. President," she said, "in 12 months we've treated over 15,000 children who would have died under the old system. Hope's story saved 15,000 lives." But Traoré was looking at a different photograph, one that showed Salamata in her nursing student uniform, holding Hope while standing next to a new ambulance funded by the Hope Foundation. "Dr. Keita," he said quietly, "Hope didn't just save 15,000 lives. She saved the soul of our country." The abandoned baby who had been left to die in a supply closet had become the catalyst for the most comprehensive healthcare reform in Burkina Faso's history. But more than that, she had proven that genuine leadership sometimes means making the most vulnerable members of society part of your own family. As they left the hospital that day, Traoré received a call from Salamata, now in her second year of nursing school. "Papa," she said. She had begun calling him father shortly after moving to the palace. Hope said her first word today. "What did she say?" Traoré asked, smiling. "She said, 'Help,'" Salamata replied. But this time, she said it because she wants to help others, not because she needs help herself. The security footage from that Thursday night had indeed been studied by psychologists around the world, not for what it revealed about politics or policy, but for what it showed about the power of a leader who chose to see a crisis through the eyes of its most vulnerable victims. The baby who had been abandoned to die had grown up to become a symbol of hope for an entire nation. And the president who had found her had learned that sometimes the most important decisions are made not in conference rooms or cabinet meetings, but on the floor of a hospital supply closet, holding a child who represents everything your government should protect. Hope was now walking, Salamata was training to save lives, and Burkina Faso had proven that when leaders choose compassion over convenience, entire societies can be transformed. The crying baby that had stopped a president in his tracks had become the heartbeat of a healthcare revolution that would save thousands of lives for generations to come. But for Ibrahim Traoré, the most important outcome wasn't political or policy related. It was personal. Every night when he returned to the palace, he was welcomed home by a young woman studying to heal others and a little girl whose name was Hope, living reminders that the best leadership decisions are often the ones that come from the heart.